Mikhail Glinka conducted the Russian National Orchestra. We heard the overture to Glinka's Ruslan and Ludmila, and that's the opening selection on tomorrow night's concert at Strathmore by the Philadelphia Orchestra with Dutoit conducting. And the orchestra will be playing a new performing edition by a local musician, David Miller, who is also a trombonist with the Fairfax Symphony Orchestra. He created this new performing edition, and it will receive its premiere tomorrow night with the Philadelphia Orchestra at Strathmore. You can find out more about that. I had a conversation with David Miller, and it's on our Classical Conversations on our website, classicalweta.org. Just click on Programs and Features and scroll down to Classical Conversations. And you're listening to Classical WETA 90.9 FM Washington and WGMS 89.1 FM Hagerstown. And the music here is made possible by your support. Thank you very much for your contribution to Classical WETA. Washington Performing Arts Society has brought quite a few fine orchestras to the Washington area this season, and the final orchestra concert for the WPAS season is the Philadelphia Orchestra. The opening of their program will be the Ruslan and Ludmila Overture, the opera overture by Mikhail Glinka. And the Philadelphia Orchestra will be premiering a new edition of this overture that was created by one of our local musicians here in the Washington area, David Miller, who is also in the trombone section of the Fairfax Symphony. Welcome, David. This is really an extremely exciting project.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you.
Tell me, what made you feel like we needed to have a new edition?
Well, that's a very good question. This project originally started as an idea where I was going to create a version for brass ensemble, and so I began to look for various sources for this. I was able to come across a version of this that's been published by Eulenberg, and from there I just started to find some other sources and realized that there were varying discrepancies, if you will, between some of the articulations and accents, and I've got a background in editing already with working for Calmus Music, putting together some various editions for them, just working with other editors. For example, one of the people I've been working with, Clinton Nieweg, former principal librarian of the Philadelphia Orchestra and is currently one of the head editors at Calmus Music. In the last few years, we've been working closely together on his new edition of Chabrier's España. And working with him, I began to look for other avenues where I could find different sources. I came across a website, Pentatone Music. They actually had a little review that described their hunt for some of the original manuscripts, and that led me to realizing that the original manuscripts are housed in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, Germany. I contacted that library and spoke to a man who was able to get me a hard copy of the earliest surviving manuscript. It's actually not in Mikhail Glinka's hand, and this is where so many of the various editors in the past have fallen into sort of a trap of treating the earliest manuscript that's available as the definitive version, when in fact it's in the hand of a copyist. In doing a lot of this research, I realized that the original manuscript was destroyed in a fire in 1859 at the Marian Theater in St. Petersburg. So this manuscript that I have is basically full of errors that I was able to go through and correct.
What kinds of errors did you most commonly find in this manuscript? Which, let me make sure I'm clear that this is the most definitive available, and it is not the composer's hand, and so therefore you might look for other changes. Besides, don't we most often hear the arrangement by Berlioz?
Yes, the Berlioz edition is in fact the most commonly played here in the United States. It's the most available. Calmus publishes it. But in terms of this and it being the earliest version, it was actually in the hand of a copyist. There have been other people who have taken the time to compare Glinka's hand to this version, and they're fairly certain that it is in the hand of a copyist. The very obvious things that I know were talking to a radio audience here, but
That's all right.
we look at this passage on the first page, the natural signs are completely missing from when the theme comes in the key of G. The C's need to be natural, and so we can see in the first violin that they've been added in a second hand. But they missed it in the second violins, the violas, and the cellos. And then
It's important information.
right, absolutely. So those things aren't some of the more major note mistakes, but when we look at the very last page, the trumpets are actually written in 2 octaves, the middle C by the second trumpet and the upper C, and we're talking about trumpet in D, so these sounding pitches would be Ds. The first trumpet is up an octave, which is incorrect. It should all be the middle C printed.
How can you tell it's incorrect?
Because with classical orchestration, which is what Glinka was working with here, we see every other instrument playing that lower octave, the flutes, the oboes, clarinets, the bassoons, and the horns there. If the first trumpet were actually playing that note, it would be the only instrument on that note, an octave above the flutes, and the flutes have the grace note passage running down.
Yeah.
And the violins as well, we can see that it's focused on a more lower timbre. So in compiling all these other sources, I have the Dutoit publication right here, which is from about 1890.
Wow.
And we're pretty certain that Rimsky-Korsakov was the head editor of this edition. And if you look at his version, he goes so far as to drop that C down to the middle C.
So you've pulled together a number of sources, and just as a performing musician, then you know to look for the kinds of things that just don't sound.
Right.
It's really amazing. When we listen to it played by the Philadelphia Orchestra, will the average audience member hear a difference and say, oh, that's not the Ruslan and Ludmila I'm used to?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is going to be they're not going to hear any difference at all. And the best way I can describe that in terms of premieres that I've been to is the fact that in the year 2000, the Philadelphia Orchestra had their 100th anniversary season, and they were featuring works exclusively composed during the 20th century to showcase the fact that they were arriving at the new millennium and that they had achieved the longevity of the 100 years. And so they had Rite of Spring on the program, but Clinton Nieweg, again, who I've been working with, had taken the time to put together his own critical edition of that piece and went back to many early sources and was able to find, by comparing different versions, over 20,000 mistakes. And I found about 50 note errors in my version and quite possibly several hundred, if not close to 1,000. I haven't counted each and every single one of them up in terms of missing staccatos or missing accents or dynamics, crescendos, these types of things. But all these mistakes are in there. But in terms of the Rite of Spring sounding any different, it really didn't sound a whole lot different. It wasn't like it was a brand new version.
But it's easier to perform for the musicians and perhaps even for the conductor.
Certainly. And that's the great thing about this version that we have here as well, is that the parts that most orchestras play off of today were published in France. And I believe it was Schott that published this originally. But the score that most conductors look off of is a re-engraving of the original Schott score. So once it was re-engraved, a lot of new errors and misinformation came in. So you can't even really compare the parts that the musicians are playing on their stands to the score that's more often than not on the conductor's stand.
This must have been a real labor of love for you.
Well, it just started to feel like a mystery that I had to unravel. And this has been something that I've been working on just in my spare time for about the last 3 years. And just to go back to what you were saying initially, when I saw the Washington Performing Arts Society pamphlet that came out about a year ago and saw that it was on the program, I went ahead and called the orchestra librarian, Bob Grossman, and he gave me confirmation that they would, in fact, go ahead and do the premiere for me. So,
David Miller, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us about your new performing edition of the Ruslan and Ludmila Overture of Glinka, and we're looking forward to hearing it with the Philadelphia Orchestra when they're here very soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much.